Journal entry number 5. The elastic deadline. Some deadlines feel less like a line and more like elastic. Imagine being given an entire month to complete a piece of work. At first, the deadline feels generous. There's time to think, time to research, time to do it properly. So, on the first day, we create a folder. We give it a sensible name. We open a new document. Perhaps we even type the title. Then we close it. There are, after all, 29 days left. A week passes. The task crosses our mind now and then, but there's still plenty of time. During the second week, we begin gathering material. We open several tabs, save a few articles, make some notes. Perhaps spend 40 minutes choosing the perfect font for a document that currently contains 11 words. It feels like progress, and in a way, it is. But the work itself remains strangely untouched. Then the final week arrives. The deadline, which once seemed pleasantly distant, suddenly develops a personality. It begins appearing in our thoughts while we eat, while we drive, while we're trying to sleep. And during the final 2 or 3 days, something remarkable happens. The fog clears. The unnecessary questions disappear. We suddenly know which sections matter, which ideas belong, which details can wait. The work that seemed to require an entire month is completed in a frantic handful of days. And somehow, this surprises us every time. If most of the meaningful work happened near the end, what were the earlier weeks doing? Did the extra time improve the quality, or did the task simply expand until it filled the space available? There's a familiar observation about this. Work expands to fill the time we give it. A task given 3 days often becomes a 3-day task. The same task given 3 weeks may somehow become a 3-week task. Not because it contains more work, but because the work changes shape. It gathers possibilities. Extra research, more revisions, longer discussions, more hesitation. A larger introduction, a second design, a third opinion. The task begins stretching towards the edges of the time around it, like elastic. Perhaps that happens because a distant deadline leaves too many questions open. How good should this be? How complete? How polished? How much research is enough? How many alternatives should we consider? When the boundary is far away, every possibility can remain alive, and possibilities aren't weightless. Each one asks to be examined, compared, discussed, perhaps reconsidered tomorrow. A distant deadline can make a simple task feel strangely important. A short report becomes a comprehensive review. A presentation becomes a complete visual identity project. A small decision somehow becomes a committee meeting. We don't necessarily produce better work. Sometimes we simply produce more versions of the same uncertainty. The extra time may also encourage a quiet bargain. We tell ourselves, I don't need to begin properly today because tomorrow is available. Tomorrow makes the same bargain with the day after. And before long, we haven't spent the month working. We've spent it knowing the work is waiting for us. That's a different kind of exhaustion. The task sits in the background of the mind without moving forwards. It isn't being completed, but it's never entirely absent. Perhaps unfinished work has a way of charging rent. It sits quietly in the corner of our attention. We may not be looking at it, but some part of us knows it's there. A long deadline can therefore create a rather odd situation. We're given more time to reduce the pressure, and use that extra time to experience the pressure for longer. Then, as the deadline approaches, the task begins to contract. What once appeared complicated becomes clearer. There's no longer time to explore every direction, so we choose one. There's no longer time to perfect every detail, so we decide which details deserve attention. There's no longer time to wait for the ideal beginning, so we begin with the beginning available to us. The approaching boundary forces the work to reveal its essential shape. This may be why some leaders set tighter deadlines than expected. Not always because they're impatient, not always because they enjoy watching people walk briskly whilst carrying laptops. Sometimes, a shorter deadline is an attempt to create clarity. When time is limited, people are more likely to ask, what is the actual outcome? What must be included? What can be removed? Which decision is holding everything up? A good deadline can make priorities visible. It can stop a task becoming larger simply because there's room for it to grow. But there's an important distinction. A tight deadline can sharpen the work. An impossible deadline can damage it. One removes unnecessary expansion. The other removes the time needed for thought, care, and correction. There's a difference between urgency and panic, between focus and haste, between asking someone to make a clear decision and asking them to complete 3 weeks of work by lunchtime. A deadline is useful when it matches the true shape of the task. Some work genuinely needs time. A difficult idea may need to rest before it becomes clear. A piece of writing may improve after a night away from it. Research may uncover something that changes the direction entirely. A thoughtful decision may require several perspectives. Time can deepen work. The time alone does not deepen anything. A month is only valuable when the month contains deliberate attention. Otherwise, it's simply a larger room in which to postpone the same decision. Perhaps the problem isn't that we're given too much time. Perhaps the problem is that the time has no internal shape. A deadline at the end of a month creates one distant boundary. But what happens inside the month? Is there a day for deciding the direction? A day for producing the first rough version? A point where feedback arrives? A moment when new ideas must stop entering? Without smaller boundaries, the entire task remains elastic until the final week. Consider how different a month feels when it contains several small endings. By the first Friday, the outline exists. By the second, the first version is complete. By the third, the important revisions are known. The final days are for finishing, not discovering what the work was supposed to be. The overall deadline hasn't changed, but the time inside it now has edges. And edges give work a shape. Perhaps we often think of deadlines as punishments, a date imposed from outside, a clock counting down, a red mark on the calendar. But a deadline can also be a form of protection. It protects a task from endless expansion. It protects a decision from being reconsidered forever. It protects the good version from being delayed by the fantasy of a perfect one. Without a boundary, some tasks never feel finished. There's always another sentence to improve, another source to consult, another feature to add, another person whose opinion might help. At some point, care becomes a disguise. Perfectionism begins wearing the clothes of responsibility, and the task continues growing. Not because quality requires it, but because finishing requires us to let go. What are we afraid will happen when we declare the work complete? Will someone find a flaw? Will the result feel smaller than the effort? Will finishing expose what the work truly is, rather than what it might still become? An unfinished project remains full of possibility. A finished one has to stand in the world as itself. Perhaps that's why we sometimes stretch the deadline, not because the work needs more time, but because we're not quite ready to release it. There's also comfort in being busy with a task. As long as we're still improving it, we don't have to face what comes next. Submission, judgment, response, or perhaps another empty page. The elastic deadline allows us to remain in preparation, and preparation often feels safer than completion. Maybe the approaching deadline helps because it ends the negotiation. The work no longer asks what it could become, it asks what it needs to be now. That question is smaller, but often far more useful. I wonder which tasks in our lives have quietly expanded beyond their true size. Which project has gathered extra complexity simply because there was time available? Which decision has remained open long after the important facts were known? Which piece of work are we still polishing because polishing feels safer than finishing? And where might a smaller boundary create relief rather than pressure? A tighter deadline isn't always the answer. Sometimes the scope is genuinely too large. Sometimes the resources are insufficient. Sometimes more time is exactly what good work requires. But perhaps more time should never be mistaken for more quality. Quality comes from attention, from judgment, from knowing what matters. Time only gives those things somewhere to happen. Work takes the shape of the time around it. A generous deadline can create depth or simply give hesitation more room. Perhaps the best deadline is neither the longest nor the shortest. Perhaps it's the one that gives the work enough space to breathe, without allowing it to spread until it fills the entire room. That's today's entry. I'd love to hear where this idea takes you. Is there something you're still working on because it truly needs more time, or because the deadline has simply continued to stretch? Until the next page, stay curious.